Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 21. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, or the place of a head in Greek. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. There have been many sermons through the nearly 2,000 years of Christian history preached on this passage. Maybe more sermons preached on this one than any other one. And lots of angles that we can take in understanding what the cross was meant to do for us, what it was meant to reveal to us, and what it obscures from us. Today, I want to consider what it is that these short events of Jesus' life reveal about who God is. Somehow, God's glory is declared in Jesus as he dies on this cross. And it's quite unconventional. It's not what would be expected. We hardly have the capacity to comprehend or to explain a being of the immensity that our God is described to be in Christian Scripture. I was thinking about this and then remembering an early church father who wrote in the 300s AD. His name was Gregory of Nazianzus. And in one of his theological orations, he wrote these words. "As to what concerns us, it is not only the peace of God which passes all understanding and knowledge, not only the things which God has stored up in promise for the righteous, which eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor mind conceived, except in a very small degree, nor the accurate knowledge of creation. For even of this I would have you know, that you have only a shadow when you hear the words, 'I will consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, and the settled order therein.' Not as if he were considering them now, but as destined to do so hereafter. But far before them, all these physical things and the universe and all that, is that nature which is above them, and out of which they spring, the incomprehensible and illimitable. Not, I mean, as to the fact of his being, but to its nature." And here's the quotation from Gregory I want to think about this morning. "For it is one thing to be persuaded of the existence of a thing, and quite another to know what it is. For it is one thing to be persuaded of the existence of a thing, and quite another to know what it is." In many ways, we could talk about the history of humanity on earth as an attempt to understand who our Creator is, what our source is, what our purpose is. And even though so much is revealed in the person of Jesus, there is more. Jesus is the tip of an iceberg that we cannot even fathom the depth of when we approach who God is. And yet somehow here on the cross, God breaks that veil that conceals him from our limited human intellects. And in the person of Jesus and his experiences there, he begins to show us a little bit of who he is essentially. A little bit of his heart. A little bit of his character. Before this, Israel only knew what God had done. And they only knew the things he had told them. But they knew almost nothing about this God other than those peripheral things. How much can you know about someone when he just kind of interacts with you intermittently over a period of time? But here, Jesus begins to reveal to us what the glory of God is. And it is so confusing and so shocking and so unexpected that most of the people who stood there watching it happen had no idea at all what they were seeing. Here's the summary statement I want to make today. Previously, through the prophets of Israel, humanity had encountered God's presence. It had witnessed a number of God's activities in history. It had received commands, guidelines, and advices from God. And it had begun to understand some of what God wanted from us. However, only in the person of Jesus did humanity have access to God with our senses, in visceral, physical, material ways. And for Mark, no event in Jesus' life is more revelatory of the reality of who God is than these moments we've just read of Jesus on the cross. This is when God's glory is revealed. So what does it reveal about God? That's our topic today. If God's glory is revealed in Jesus' crucifixion for us, then Mark has highlighted at least 3 aspects of Jesus' crucifixion that reveal who God is to us. And through this, help to make sense of the entire history that we've experienced as humans on earth. 3 aspects of Jesus' crucifixion that reveal God to us. The first is this: the glory of God is mutuality. Community. The glory of God is mutuality. Look at verses 21 to 27. The strange details Mark gives us here. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then after they brought Jesus to the cross, we're told in verse 27 that he wasn't crucified alone. With him, they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Is it interesting to you that Mark wants us to be certain to know that Jesus did not get to the site of his crucifixion alone? All of his people had abandoned him, but he did not get to the site of his crucifixion by himself. We have no story of the solitary hero in Jesus, who endures everything he endures alone, who stands before insurmountable forces by strength of his own will, who marches himself up to the point of his execution. Socrates drinks the hemlock, pontificating the whole time, and then valiantly lays down his life. That's not the story Mark tells. Now, apparently the way Mark told this story, because Luke and Matthew tell it the same way, so bothered the Apostle John that he makes a correction in his gospel, and he reminds us that Jesus did in fact carry his own cross. Apparently it really bothered John. Probably what that means or implies is that Simon didn't carry it for him, but rather helped him with it. But Mark wants to emphasize the reality that Jesus needed help to get to Calvary. And not just divine help, human help. Simon of Cyrene. Matter of fact, his children are mentioned here probably because they were known to the church to whom Mark was writing. And this is the revelation of God to us. And I think if we have eyes to see, we'll recognize that this story we see here with Jesus partnering with Simon to get himself to Calvary is the story that we are told over and over and over again throughout the Scriptures. God comes down and he gives law and guidelines. He rescues his people and he delivers them. And then God suddenly retreats and leaves human beings to make choices and decisions on their own. We've seen it over and over again in the Garden of Eden. God comes down, he creates that garden, he creates male and female. He creates the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He tells them not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then he leaves them. He goes someplace. And they're there alone in the garden with a serpent that wants them to eat of the tree, thinking about it. And he lets them make the decision to eat. With Cain and Abel, we don't even know if God told them how to make sacrifices, but somehow they had this desire to make sacrifices to God. They make sacrifices. Abel's sacrifice is pleasing to God. Cain's is not pleasing. God retreats. Cain's angry. God comes back and he says to Cain, you need to master this. Sin is trying to take you over. If you do what is right, you will be pleasing. So master this sin that's crouching at your tent flap. And then he leaves. And Cain goes out and murders his brother. Sodom and Gomorrah, the nation of Israel, the period of the judges, King David and all the kings afterwards. Even in Jesus' own life with his own disciples, he comes and he casts out demons and he heals diseases. And then he sends out, you remember this sermon that we preached on this, he sends out his disciples to go do that ministry on their own, 2 by 2. And he stays back and he lets them go. And then they come back and they report to him. Over and over and over again, God uses humans to accomplish his will. On the cross again, the same story is told again. Jesus partners with a human to carry the cross to Golgotha. Is that an interesting detail that Mark gives us? I suspect he gave it to us because he wanted his audience to understand that we participate with Jesus in what he's trying to accomplish in the world. The glory of God is mutuality. If you have carried with you the idea that the ideal Christian stands alone and is a kind of a monad who worships God as an isolated hermit, listening to no one and relying on no one, we've failed to live into the story of Jesus. Even Jesus had help carrying the cross. The glory of God is mutuality. Secondly, the glory of God is reticence. It means not telling people everything they might need to know. Notice Jesus on the cross. Look at verse 29. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ah, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him amongst themselves. Why doesn't he respond? It would seem that the most important thing for Jesus to do right now is to explain the significance of the cross. Why doesn't he tell them what he's doing? Why does Jesus' silence remain absolute? What does it reveal? Why does he not explain himself? Why does he not answer the objections? Why is he content to appear weak and vulnerable and even duplicitous? Because dying on the cross, he looks like a liar. He said he was of God, that he's the Messiah. If that's true, why is he content to appear that way? Well, here again, we begin to see who God is. And it's not a story that's new to us. If we read through the First Testament, we see it all over the place. God in Jesus and throughout history apparently does not appear to fear being misunderstood. He doesn't appear to fear being misjudged. He seems to be willing to let his actions speak for themselves. And he seems content to let his onlookers draw their own conclusions about him. We have to remember that for Jesus, this is not the end of the story. This is simply part of the story. And he is not one to give away too much of the ending before it occurs. We always want to anticipate, based on where we are right now, what the story is going to be, how it's going to turn out, how the final act is going to go. But one of my life verses, I've shared it with you before, is Proverbs chapter 25, verse 2. And it says this: "It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out." It's the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. In many ways, history is a system of God concealing and humans uncovering what God has hidden for us to find. And the cross is similar to that. It reminds me of a passage from a very difficult book. It's called A Grief Observed. It was written by C.S. Lewis. This is part of what he wrote. "Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you're tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You might as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in time of trouble?" He goes on to say, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not so there's no God after all, but instead, so this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer." Now, those of you who've studied C.S. Lewis's life, you know that he was a faithful man. But this is real and visceral experience of living in the dark and wondering where God is. This is the cross. This is the experience. I don't know the story of these people who were mocking Jesus, but I imagine that some of them probably followed him. I mean, they knew some of his teachings. They knew he had talked about the destruction of the temple, which is something he had only said amongst a small group of followers. And so they knew some of this information. Maybe they're coming there hurt, saying, "I thought you were going to deliver us. My life stinks. I thought you were going to heal us. I thought you were going to set us free. Here you are, dying on a cross. Save yourself and save us." But he doesn't. In fact, it was only by that death he could save them. But that wasn't the salvation they wanted. Jesus will not speak out of turn. In the middle of the story, he is hesitant, reticent to give out what is coming next. He lets us make our conclusions. He stays silent. The glory of God is mutuality. He had help getting to the cross. The glory of God is reticence. God does not speak simply to answer human objections to the way the story is going. And finally, this morning, the glory of God is weakness. Look at verse 32. This is what the chief priests and the scribes say to him. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Humans are drawn to power. And this is also in the scriptures. Genesis tells us that from the earliest days of humanity, humans praised and followed conquerors. We have always been drawn to power. Now maybe that's a trace of our desire for God himself, because honestly, who is more powerful than the God described in Scripture? So our desire to chase after power and might be a hunger after God that we search in very human ways. That's possible. But whatever our reasons, our lust for power and security and protection and prosperity has shaped the world in which we live. Many of us will sacrifice almost anything just to be a little safer, a little healthier, a little more protected, a little bit less pain. But the glory of God revealed in Jesus chooses another way. God is powerful. He seems to have the ability to do all these things that we hope and wish that he would for us. And yet what he reveals on the cross is that God's true strength is revealed not in those overt activities, but in his refusal to protect himself from assaults that are far weaker than him. However willing to judge and destroy and punish God may be, he seems to value humility, weakness, and vulnerability above all else. The glory of Jesus is in having a power he chooses not to exercise in his own defense. The glory of Jesus and the glory of God is not in being powerless, but in refusing to use power as a means to your own glorification. God receives glory by not being God in this moment, by submitting himself to being human, as vulnerable and as weak as we are. It's in that he reveals his glory. Because most of us, if we could, would escape a moment like this one. Our whole lives are designed to escape these moments. And this struggles, it's hard for us, not because he did that to himself, but because he seems to do it to us. And that is frustrating to us, but it is so within his character. It's reminding me of an incident in one of the letters that Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote from prison. If you're not familiar with him, he was a German theologian during World War II. He was part of a resistance movement against the Nazis, the underground, the confessing church, they were called. He wasn't directly involved in the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler's life, but he was part of a group that tried to do that. And when it failed, they were all arrested and then eventually executed. And so he was arrested as part of that group, put in prison, and he wrote letters. And they were hard letters to read. Many have probably read The Cost of Discipleship. Fewer have read his epistles from prison. But here's a quotation from one of them. The linchpin is removed from the whole structure of Christianity to date. Our coming of age forces us to a true recognition of our situation vis-a-vis God. God is teaching us that we must live as men who can get along very well without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. The God who makes us live in this world without using him as a working hypothesis is the God before whom we are ever standing. Before God and with him we live without God. God is weak and powerless in the world, and that's exactly the only way in which He can be with us and help us. Matthew 8:17 makes it crystal clear that it's not by His omnipotence that Christ helps us, but by His weakness and suffering. We serve a God who comes and sits with us, who dies with us. And that's what Bonhoeffer means. His experience in that prison cell was that God was saving him through not saving him. That God was transforming him by not fixing him. That God was setting him free by not rescuing him from his times. That's Bonhoeffer's moment. Maybe you've been there too. Those moments that we just don't know how this could be a moment God would want for me. And I'm not sure He does want it, but He does understand it. And in some ways, this is the world He's created. The glory of God is mutuality. Jesus has help getting to the cross. The glory of God is reticence. Jesus refuses to defend Himself on the cross. And the glory of God is weakness. He saves us by not saving Himself. He saves us by dying. That is not a story that makes any sense. And yet it upends the entire world. So here's the question I want to conclude with. How does Jesus save us on the cross? Why this road? Now, of course, the cross settles issues of forgiveness and redemption for us. And that's where we've really focused our conversation in recent years in the church. And that's still true. But there's something else that the cross delivers us from that we cannot forget, and Mark puts it in front of us. The cross saves us from our self-delusion that power can set us free. Early 20th century Scottish theologian P.T. Forsyth wrote a book called The Justification of God, and he was writing in the middle of World War I. And he says this: "Where shall we get the idea of what is worthy of God? There can only be one source of such knowledge. It's the final account God gives of Himself. It's no expectation of ours, no presumption in us of what a God-like God would do, no imagination of a God projected from our need. God's account of Himself, of His way with man, and of the purpose He infuses into history, His account of His will on the scale and depth of the great convulsive judgments, is in Christ and His cross, or it is nowhere. It's in the cross," he goes on to say, "which so many are disposed to treat as an incident or at most an object lesson, though one falsified by all the stern course of history. The cross of Christ, with its judgment grace, its tragic love, its grievous glory, its severe salvation, and its finished work, is God's only self-justification in such a world. But is it not salvation full and free? Surely. Full of the passion which sets the soul free for Himself. Free? It was of His own will. Hard? Yes. But hardest of all, for Him. He took on Himself there more than He ever inflicts. And His infliction from us there, He turns into His redemption. The cross meant more change in God than in man. It was His own act of changing judgment into mercy, His own miracle. And its first concern was His holy love, not ours. On the cross, God takes the worst humanity can deal to Him, and He does not fight against it, and through it, He saves us all. That story will be replayed in your life and mine. There is no way to avoid it. We too will suffer and see ourselves saved by that suffering. There's no avoiding it. This is how God operates. This is how He makes all things new. And you will become something more than you could ever be by having passed through the darkness you would have avoided if you could have chosen it. That's His promise, that He turns chaos into life. That's creation. It goes all the way back to Genesis. When God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. Darkness covered the surface of the deep. The world was chaos. There was no life. And God took that chaos and He shaped it into the world that we know. And He shows us that at that moment of our deepest despair, and our darkest fears, the moment where we feel the most vulnerable and the most powerless. It's in that moment that we will be transformed into beings made in the image of God. The moment of our transformation and salvation is there, in that place. All of us enter a darkness that we will not get out of apart from the resurrection of the dead. That's inevitable. But all of us enter other darknesses out of which God will resurrect us too. And we will always be stronger if we follow Him. We will always be more resilient to the darkness if we can give Him our faith in that moment. The church has tried to sell a story because it's appealing to the world that God is a superhero who rescues His people from pain. But that's not the story of the cross, and I'm sure if you've read it, you've wondered how we ever got that idea by reading the cross. The story of the cross is that He can bring you out of whatever He leads you into. And if you follow Him in faith, then what the world thinks to be the darkest of moments for you will be the moment in which you are free. That's our faith. I hope you can trust Him.